Welcome back to episode 30 of More Than Words, where we discover that the Irish Sea isn't finished with us yet, and that the North Wales coast is essentially a masterclass in Victorian ambition, followed by the slow, damp realisation that ambition has consequences. This week, a resort so committed to its own gentility it created planning rules to keep Blackpool at a safe distance, a town that went from medieval market to I'm a celebrity jungle in one architectural leap nobody asked for, and a lighthouse built in 1763 that is technically older than the United States of America and considerably better maintained. Expect a castle built by a man who may have been poisoned, possibly plotted against the Queen and definitely didn't finish his to-do list. A Victorian tower taller than Blackpool's that rusted into oblivion in 20 years because nobody could be bothered to maintain it. And a beach full of iron men staring philosophically at the horizon while the tide dissolves them one winter at a time. Think Rhyl's spectacular decades-long economic obituary meets Formby's last red squirrels, meets a grandstand so close to the sea it had to be abandoned when the Irish Sea simply decided it was in the way. Narrated by someone who understands that maintenance is the unglamorous glue holding everything together, walking the same loop because if he doesn't, something somewhere will definitely start creaking. This is episode 30. Keeping it Rhyl. Time for the stats then. So the total distance covered so far is 1,665 kilometres. That's 57.73% of the entire 2,884 kilometre journey, which means we're nudging towards 60%, still in the second half, still moving, still logging it all in a spreadsheet that has begun to feel less like a tool and more like a personality trait. The time taken in real life was from the 18th to the 22nd of January 2026. 5 days, which is efficient and which passed without dramatic incident, fresh injury or meteorological theatre. No thundersnow, no muscle rebellions, just walking, golf and the quiet rhythm of a week that delivered its mileage and asked for nothing in return. My current position is 5 days ahead of schedule. The buffer is no longer a buffer, it's a statement of intent. Mr. XL has relaxed to a degree that is, frankly, slightly unsettling. We're not reading too much into this. 5 days is a cushion, not a holiday, and the road ahead is long enough to swallow any advantage without even slowing down. IRL. Adventures in mild continuity. Retirement was supposed to create space. Instead, it's generated a routine. One largely built out of shoes, pavements, and a frankly suspicious level of spreadsheet governance. The calendar emptied, and in the vacuum an Apple Watch marched in, set up a desk, and began issuing performance reviews. I don't commute anymore, but I still clock in, usually to stretches of tarmac that have started to memorise the soles of my trainers. I've now travelled an improbable distance without meaningfully going anywhere, which feels either meditative or faintly fraudulent, depending on how much time you spend thinking about maps. Stage 30 in real life didn't involve crossing borders so much as repeatedly renegotiating the same ones. Curb to road, path to mud, golf course to apologetic detour. It's long-haul mileage achieved in short familiar loops, the geographic equivalent of circumnavigating the planet by pacing your kitchen. By this point, the walking isn't about improvement anymore. It's about keeping the machinery operational and proving to myself that nothing vital has seized up. I'm not training for anything. There's no race, no summit, no heroic before and after montage waiting at the end. This isn't optimisation, it's upkeep. Fitness as preventative maintenance. Exercise so future me remains at least partially negotiable and doesn't seize up like a neglected hinge. That shift from progress to preservation is its own quiet retirement milestone. Work used to provide structure, purpose and the comforting illusion that effort produced outcomes. Walking provides structure too, but without the narrative arc. You turn up, you move forward, you return roughly to where you started, and the only performance appraisal is numerical. No one applauds, no one asks for a summary deck, just a spreadsheet no one will ever see, ticking on, indifferent. It's also worth noting what this journey very deliberately isn't. I'm not trekking across Greenland, or trying to colonise it. I'm not reopening the Northwest Passage, or testing any international agreements that have survived since the Enlightenment. In a week, and in an era where diplomacy is increasingly treated as an optional extra and long-standing alliances are trampled with the breezy confidence of someone who's never read a treaty in their life, my own ambitions remain reassuringly small. No borders crossed, no alliances strained, just a man of a certain age, some spreadsheets, and a walking route that hasn't yet triggered a trade dispute. What walking has replaced most effectively, though, is work thinking. Long stretches of movement now soak up the mental bandwidth once occupied with agendas, action points, and the low-grade anxiety of being across things. There's reflection, certainly, plenty of it, but no conclusions are required. Strategic thinking minus the strategy. Ideas are allowed to drift in, wander about for a bit, and then leave without necessarily being captured, filed or monetised. And when an idea does get acted on, the impact is local and politely negligible. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes, nothing trends. These are domestic policy adjustments, not geopolitical earthquakes. This week didn't deliver standout heroics or fresh anecdotes. No dramatic weather, no milestone fireworks. And that, perhaps, is the point. Stage 30 is what the project looks like once the novelty has worn off and routine has settled in. The walking continues, the numbers accrue. The plot may have thinned, but at least the protagonist is still upright, which, at this stage of life, counts as a character arc. A very retirement-appropriate lesson, really. Virtual Insanity Stage 30. The Irish Sea Crossing, Part 2. Stage 30 doesn't so much begin as resume the indignity of Stage 29, still bobbing around the Irish Sea like a bath toy abandoned by a giant toddler, the Isle of Man dissolving behind us, Liverpool Bay allegedly somewhere ahead, and a faint delusional optimism creeping in purely because the concept of land has re-entered the chat. Solid ground remains a rumour, but at least the coastlines are inching closer, gaining definition, and occasionally resembling real places, rather than the maritime Rorschach tests you squint at until they agree to be Wales. This stretch drifts down the North Wales coast, Llandudno to Prestatyn, before swinging east as Liverpool Bay finally decides to reveal itself. It's the last gasp of nautical make-believe until the Isles of Scilly wrap this whole escapade up. The penultimate chapter of squinting at distant shapes and insisted we've visited somewhere when, in reality, we've merely sailed vaguely in its direction while praying for enough visibility to confirm it hasn't been quietly removed from the map. There's a particular kind of madness to this phase. Long-distance tourism conducted at binocular range, ticking off coastal towns like a man completing his shopping list by staring through the supermarket window. Yes, that's definitely Prestatyn, you say, confidently identifying a greyish smear that could just as easily be a rogue fingerprint on the lens. Onward then, the Welsh coast, the English coast, and, eventually, at the very start of the next stage, Liverpool, assuming the ferry timetable behaves and we can still remember which way is shore. Off with its headland. For a bit of variety, we're looking south to the Welsh coast first this time, tracking the settlements we pass on the long maritime slalom toward Liverpool from the west, before turning our attention east to the English coast so we can drop into Liverpool from the north like that was the plan all along, and not the result of several hours of aquatic improvisation. Llandudno rises from the sea in that unmistakable way only a Victorian resort built on former marshland can. Wales's largest seaside town, wedged neatly between the Great Orme and the Little Orme like a polite geological sandwich filling. The Great Orme looms over the town, a 679-foot limestone headland named from the Old Norse Orme, meaning serpent, because Vikings sailing past it thought it resembled a sea dragon and presumably decided not to hang around in case it woke up and demanded tribute. Before the mid-19th century, this entire stretch was bog, mostly uninhabitable, unprofitable, and avoided by anyone with even a passing interest in dry socks. Then Owen Williams, a Liverpool architect with ideas above sea level, pitched Lord Mostyn a plan to turn the swamp into a resort. Mostyn, instantly recognising the commercial potential of a glorified sponge, agreed, and Llandudno began its transformation into a grid-patterned holiday machine, curving politely along the North Beach. The timing was immaculate. The Chester and Holyhead Railway had reached Llandudno Junction in 1848, and a branch line followed in 1858, delivering Liverpudlians, Mancunians, and assorted industrial escapees directly to the seaside the moment they discovered holidays were a thing they were allowed to have. In short order, Llandudno was soon marketed as the Queen of the Welsh watering places, a title also claimed by Tenby and Aberystwyth, suggesting Wales was running some sort of constitutional monarchy with multiple claimants and no clear succession plan. Victorian Llandudno was built to be respectable. Wide boulevards, pale-painted hotels, a promenade designed for strolling rather than staggering, and planning rules strict enough to make Blackpool look like a lawless frontier outpost. No pleasure beach, no illuminations, no hats demanding kisses. Just sea air, decorum, and the lingering suspicion you failed an unspoken dress code. The Great Orme Tramway, opened in 1902, still clanks its way up the slope using the same cable haul system it always has. Britain's last surviving street tramway of its kind, and a reminder that Victorian engineering was built to outlive both empires and common sense. At the summit, a cafe, sweeping views across Snowdonia and the Irish Sea, the occasional glimpse of the Isle of Man, and a population of Kashmiri goats, who've lived here since the late 19th century and behave like they own the place. During lockdown, they achieved global fame by wandering into town, eating hedges, ignoring social distancing, and generally acting like they were reclaiming ancestral land. They've since become local celebrities, starring in news reports, irritating gardeners, and even inspiring a new illustrated book celebrating their mischief. Llandudno's Victorian pier, built in 1878 and stretching 2,295 feet into the sea, remains Wales's longest. It still hosts amusements, Punch and Judy shows performed by descendants of the man who brought Punch here in 1860, and donkey rides run by descendants of the woman who introduced them 125 years ago, a multi-generational commitment to tradition that borders on performance art. There's even a literary connection. Alice Liddell, the inspiration for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, spent her childhood summers here, where Charles Dodgson told her the stories that became the book. The Penmorfa Hotel where she stayed was demolished in 2009 despite public protest, proving that even Wonderland can't compete with developers who've spotted an opportunity for flats. Today, Llandudno remains Wales's premier seaside resort, home to around 20,000 people, and fiercely protective of its Victorian character through planning restrictions, preservation orders, and a collective determination not to become Rhyl. One of those bays. Colwyn Bay is one of those North Wales towns that feels like it was designed by a Victorian committee who couldn't decide between seaside resort and light administrative hub. So they built both, then added a zoo for good measure. It's the largest settlement on the North Wales coast apart from Rhyl, though, unlike Rhyl, Colwyn Bay has so far dodged the full post-apocalyptic funfair aesthetic by maintaining just enough economic diversity to survive the collapse of British coastal tourism. The town proudly calls itself the Garden Town of Wales, a phrase that conjures images of pergolas, fountains, and gentle breezes wafting across manicured lawns, until you realise it refers specifically to Ireas Park and the promenade gardens, rather than implying the entire town resembles Kew. Up on the hillside sits the Welsh Mountain Zoo, 37 acres of woodland paths, panoramic views, and animals who definitely did not sign up for the North Wales microclimate. Snow leopards, Sumatran tigers, chimpanzees, red pandas, penguins, all of them presumably wondering what they did in a past life to be reincarnated somewhere where the wind can slice you into ribbons. Colwyn Bay also had a pier, Victoria Pier, which followed the standard British pier life cycle. Built in 1900, popular for decades, then caught fire. Twice. The first fire in 1922 destroyed the pavilion. The second, in 2008, finished the job. The remains were demolished in 2017, and although a short rebuilt pier opened in 2021, it's more a symbolic gesture than Victorian showpiece. The architectural equivalent of replacing a cathedral with a bus shelter and hoping no one mentions it. But the town has cultural pedigree. It hosted the National Eisteddfod in 1910 and 1947 and has won gold in Wales in Bloom, and boasts a 3-mile promenade linking it to Ross-on-Sea, home to St Trillo's Chapel, one of Britain's smallest churches, seating 6 people if they all agree to breathe in and nobody has opinions about personal space. It's less a chapel and more a spiritual phone box. Welsh took a trial. Abergele sits there on the North Wales coast like it's been put in timeout between Rhyl and Colwyn Bay, a market town whose name literally means mouth of the River Gelly, which is refreshingly honest for Wales, a country where half the place names sound like someone sneezing mid-sentence and the other half look like they were generated by a keyboard falling downstairs. Just up the road is Gwrych Castle, a 19th century Gothic revival pile built by someone who apparently decided a stately home should arrive pre-haunted, like a Victorian starter pack. It spent 150 years cultivating a brooding, moss-covered mystique, only to end up hosting I'm a Celebrity Get Me Out of Here during the pandemic because Australia was closed and ITV needed somewhere with turrets, adequate plumbing and enough atmosphere to imply danger without actually providing any. Imagine being a castle that prepared for ghosts and instead got Ant Dec, plus a rota of celebrities eating kangaroo bits in the rain. But Abergele's most infamous chapter is the rail disaster, one of the bleakest in British railway history. In August 1868, a set of goods wagons loaded with paraffin barrels broke free at Llandudno and careered downhill into the path of the oncoming Irish Mail Express. The collision ignited the paraffin, producing an intense fire that engulfed the first carriages and killed 33 people, many of whom were so badly burned they couldn't be identified. The tragedy shocked Victorian Britain, prompted major scrutiny of railway safety practices, and led to reforms including the introduction of catch points and stricter handling of hazardous materials. Today, a memorial stands in St Michael's churchyard, marking a disaster once described as the Lockerbie of its time, a phrase that tells you everything about the scale of it and nothing about the quiet, unassuming little town that didn't ask for a starring role in tragedy but got one anyway. Horses for courses. Towyn sits between Abergele and Rhyl, like the bit of coastline someone forgot to file paperwork for. A seaside settlement whose name comes from the Welsh Towyn, meaning beach or sand dune, which is admirably literal for a place that is, in fact, mostly beach and sand dunes. It forms part of the Kinmel Bay and Towyn community, a stretch of coast where a majority of residents were born in England, which explains why the local accent sometimes sounds like it's buffering mid-sentence. Tir Prince Raceway is the town's main attraction. A racetrack, funfair and retail market that feels like someone tried to build Blackpool from memory using only the bits people secretly enjoy and whatever they found in the back of a shed. It was founded by Billy Williams, a man who once swapped his Ford Cortina for a horse and then walked it home like it was a perfectly normal Tuesday, radiating pure Jack and the Beanstalk energy. The raceway grew from a patch of derelict land in 1990 into a full harness racing circuit and amusement complex. Proof that if you build it, they will come, and if you add gambling, they'll arrive early and bring friends. Towyn's most dramatic moment came in February 1990, when the sea decided to visit uninvited. A storm surge, high tides, and sea defences that could generously be described as aspirational led to a 400-metre breach that flooded roughly 10 square kilometres of land. Around 2,800 houses were evacuated, with up to 5,000 people displaced, one of the largest peacetime evacuations in modern Welsh history. Princess Diana even visited later that year, which is how you know it was serious. She didn't turn up for light drizzle and a damp caravan. The disaster prompted a massive coastal defence overhaul, transforming Towyn seawall from Victorian optimism into something that might actually survive a conversation with the Irish Sea, which is progress if nothing else. Today Towyn has returned to its natural state, a caravan-heavy holiday zone where people check timetables with the same intensity other towns reserved for football scores, and where the sea is treated less like a scenic backdrop and more like a powerful neighbour who once kicked the door in and might do it again. A real shame. Rhyl sits on the Denbighshire coast, a flat stretch of North Wales where the Irish Sea meets a wind so abrasive it could strip wallpaper. The name likely comes from Rhyl, the sandbanks, a nod to the shifting coastal landscape that shaped the place long before the tourists arrived. Victorian Rhyl was once a proper contender. Blackpool without the electricity bill, Brighton without the Londoners. The railways arrived in 1848, the pier followed in 1867, and suddenly the industrial northwest had somewhere to go and quietly simmer in a deck chair. Hotels multiplied, the Marine Lake opened in 1895, and for decades Rhyl was the working class Riviera. Then the 1970s happened. cheap flights to Spain arrived, and British holidaymakers realised they could get guaranteed sunshine instead of Rhyl's traditional weather pattern of horizontal rain with a chance of disappointment. Visitor numbers collapsed. The pier closed in 1973, the fun fair shut, and the town's economic base evaporated faster than a puddle in Benidorm. By 2000, Rhyl West was officially the most deprived area in Wales. In 2019, it was still number 1. In 2025, still number 1. At this point, it's less a statistic and more the world's grimmest lifetime achievement award. Rhyl's population dropped by nearly 5% in the decade to 2021, which is impressive because most towns don't lose people unless there's lava involved. It has 4 beaches, multiple food banks, and enough deprivation to keep PhD students in material until the sun burns out. It's a place where regeneration plans arrive with the same frequency as storms, and often with similar outcomes. In 2025, Denbighshire County Council announced yet another transformation. £200 million on coastal defences, green spaces and attractions, part of a decade-long attempt to drag Rhyl back from the brink. There's even a £250 million regeneration programme aimed at revitalising the high street and derelict buildings. Because if you're going to reinvent yourself, you might as well do it with a GDP of a small nation. The Telegraph called Rhyl Blackpool after a neutron bomb, which feels unnecessarily savage given the town's history, but also weirdly on brand for a place that's been repeatedly kicked by fate, economics and the British weather. But here's the twist, Rhyl refuses to die. It's the seaside resort equivalent of a battered arcade machine that still lights up when you put a quid in. It just keeps regenerating like a seaside Time Lord. It also stands as Britain's eternal warning. If your entire economy can be replaced by a £29.99 flight to Alicante, there's a very good chance it will be. Offa the beaten path. Our last view of Wales for this whole escapade is of Prestatyn, one of those places that feels like the end of something, geographically, spiritually, and for anyone who's just walked the full length of Offa's Dyke path, emotionally. You arrive at the seafront, spot the little stone marker and think, yes, this is exactly where a 177-mile medieval boundary wall should end, next to a leisure centre and a bloke eating chips in the wind. Offa's Dyke itself was built in the 8th century by King Offa of Mercia, allegedly to mark the border with Wales, though historians still can't decide whether it was defensive, administrative or just the world's earliest passive-aggressive garden fence. Even the name Prestatyn sounds like it's trying to explain itself. It comes from Old English words meaning priests and farm, so essentially priest's farm, which is a bold claim for a town whose modern pilgrimage site is a retail park with a Marks and Spencer. The Romans were here too, because of course they were everywhere. Prestatyn even has Roman baths, discovered in the 1930s and then again in the 1980s because someone accidentally built a housing estate on top of them, which is the most North Wales archaeological plot twist imaginable. Restoration work continues, presumably so future generations can also marvel at the fact that Romans had nicer bathrooms than we do. As a seaside resort, Prestatyn grew up in the Victorian era, but on a smaller scale than Llandudno or Rhyl. Basically, the seaside equivalent of saying, we do fun, but let's not get carried away. It attracted holidaymakers who wanted beaches without crowds or vulgarity, which is a polite way of saying people who found Rhyl a bit too much. Today, it's home to around 19,000 residents, a promenade, sandy beaches and a certain charm. The end-of-the-road energy, the walkers limping triumphantly into town, the Roman ruins hiding under cul-de-sacs, and beaches that are genuinely lovely when the weather isn't trying to kill you. Peer review. We now turn our attention to the English coast on the approach to Liverpool Bay. Southport sits 16 miles north of Liverpool, rising out of the sand dunes with a population of around 90,000. It was purpose-built for leisure in 1792 by William Sutton, an innkeeper with the entrepreneurial instinct of a man who looked at a windy stretch of sand and thought, yes, people will absolutely pay to sit here and be exfoliated by nature. And somehow he was right. The place was planned from the start. Wide boulevards, tree-lined avenues, and villas that looked like they were designed for genteel promenading rather than the usual British seaside activities of fighting, frying or crying. Lord Street, the town's grand central boulevard, was laid out in the 1820s by the local lords of the manor, who insisted on tasteful development. No industry, no noise, nothing offensive. Which is why Southport still feels like the sort of place where even the pigeons have good posture. Then there's Southport Pier. Opened in 1860, stretching 3,635 feet into the Irish Sea and still functional. Unlike most British piers, which tend to specialise in burning down, collapsing or becoming metaphors for national decline. Southport avoided the Rhyl-style death spiral by diversifying early. Retail, tick. Chapel Street and Lord Street have been relieving visitors of their money since the 19th century. Conferences, tick. The Southport Theatre and Convention Centre hosts everything from corporate events to touring productions. Golf? Oh, absolutely. Royal Birkdale is one of the jewels of the Open Championship rota, hosting the tournament again in July this year, and remains one of the few places where men in pastoral trousers can walk with dignity. And then there's the commuter factor, close enough to Liverpool to attract professionals, but far enough away to maintain the illusion of refinement. And of course, there's Pleasureland, Southport's immortal, on-again, off-again amusement park. A place that has died and resurrected itself so many times, it's basically the seaside's answer to a soap opera villain. Opened in 1913, it has since gone through more ownership changes, closures, bankruptcies and phoenix-like rebirths than any sane business should survive. Southport is a seaside resort that endured by refusing to behave like a seaside resort, and Pleasureland is its undead familiar. It's been declared dead more times than Dracula, but still turns up every summer asking if you want candy floss. Squirreled away. Formby is one of those places that looks like it was designed by a committee who couldn't decide between prehistoric mystery, wildlife documentary and executive commuter haven, so they simply nodded, shrugged and greenlit the lot. South of Southport and home to roughly 23,000 people, red squirrels and ancient footprints, it's the sort of place where even the sand seems to have a backstory and probably a 3-part Netflix deal in pre-production. The National Trust's Formby Point is a pine-wooded, dune-stacked coastal sprawl where several hundred red squirrels cling to existence like tiny ginger-furred aristocrats refusing to be pushed out by their brash American cousins. The greys, introduced in the 19th century because Victorians apparently collected invasive species the way modern households collect air fryers, brought with them squirrel pox, a virus harmless to greys but catastrophic to reds, a kind of rodent Cold War that Britain's native squirrels have been losing for over a century. Volunteers in Formby treat grey squirrel sightings with the same diplomatic subtlety as a territorial incursion, which is fair enough when your local wildlife is one bad winter away from becoming folklore. And then there are the footprints. Not the someone walked their dog before the tide came in kind, but Mesolithic and Neolithic tracks, 5,000 to 8,000 years old, preserved in mud and periodically revealed by the tide like nature's own Etch-a-Sketch. Adults, children, red deer, wild boar, all wandering this coastline long before Formby became a place where people in gilets walked labradoodles. The prints appear and vanish depending on the weather, tide and luck, meaning you can spend an afternoon trudging across mudflats only to find nothing but a disappointed National Trust volunteer trying to look optimistic. Modern Formby, meanwhile, is an affluent commuter enclave for Liverpool professionals who want beaches, good schools and property prices that whisper exclusive without requiring you to maintain a moat. The pine woods were acquired by the National Trust in 1967 to stabilise the dunes. And today they're also home to the elusive natterjack toad, because Formby apparently collects rare species like a side quest that spiralled out of control. Place of interest. Crosby is where Merseyside decides to get theatrical. You're rolling down the coast towards Liverpool minding your own business, and suddenly the beach is full of iron blokes staring moodily at the horizon like they've just realised the last train's been cancelled and they're going to have to get the rail replacement bus. Anthony Gormley's Another Place, 100 cast-iron versions of the artist himself, all arranged along 3 kilometres of shoreline, has been standing there since 2005, looking like the world's most introspective stag do. Each figure is positioned somewhere between high and low tide, which means some spend half their lives underwater, some only appear at low tide, and all of them are slowly dissolving under the Irish Sea's relentless exfoliation routine. Gormley said the work explores time and tide, ebb and flow, and the relationship between human and natural time, which is art speak for standing very still on a beach and hoping meaning happens. The whole thing was meant to be temporary, here for a few months, then gone. But Crosby did the most un-British thing imaginable. It liked the public art. It liked it so much that Sefton Council bought the installation outright in 2007, making Crosby one of the few times where a major artwork wasn't removed because someone complained it looked a bit weird from their conservatory. Now it's iconic, endlessly photographed, endlessly debated, endlessly used as a backdrop for moody Instagram poses, including mine, because of course I'm not above it. It's a lovely beach and a striking monument, and I've visited several times. But Crosby's flair for the dramatic didn't start with the Iron Nudists. The name itself is Norse, crosser and beer, which sounds like something you should hear on Match of the Day, but actually means village with the cross. The Vikings turned up around 900 AD and left behind place names, a scattering of artefacts, and the general vibe that Crosby is the sort of place where you might find a longship parked up if you check behind the dunes. By the 19th century, Crosby had reinvented itself as a sea bathing destination, the Victorian version of a wellness retreat, except with more wool and fewer smoothies. And today it's a patchwork of neighbourhoods stitched together by dunes, sandstone outcrops, and the faint sound of someone explaining to a visitor that yes, the statues are supposed to look like that. Cloudy with a chance of treasure. On the cusp of entering Liverpool Bay, we see Leasowe off the starboard side of the ferry. It's the point on the Wirral where the landscape stops pretending to be normal and starts behaving like a history teacher who's been waiting years for someone to ask about this exact stretch of coastline and is now unstoppable. You arrive expecting a quiet stretch of coast and maybe a dog walker or two. Instead, you get a lighthouse from 1763, a castle founded by a possibly poisoned Elizabethan aristocrat, and a beach that coughs up Viking artefacts like it's clearing its throat. Leasowe Lighthouse appears first, tall and pale, the oldest surviving brick lighthouse in Britain. It was built by the Liverpool Docks Committee, who were tired of ships mistaking the Wirral for a suggestion rather than a coastline. It's 110 feet high, elegant, and has the energy of a building that's seen too many storms and not enough gratitude. It was decommissioned in 1908, presumably because the sea was told to behave itself, and now it's kept going by volunteers who keep a close eye on anything that splashes. Then there's Leasowe Castle, built in 1593 by Ferdinando Stanley, 5th Earl of Derby, a man who may or may not have been involved in a plot to claim the throne, may or may not have been a patron of Shakespeare, and may or may not have been poisoned. The castle has been a hotel, a convalescent home, a private residence, and a wedding venue, which is basically the architectural equivalent of someone who's changed careers too many times and now introduces themselves as a creative. One of its ballrooms is floored with wood salvaged from a wrecked ship, because nothing says romance like dancing on the remains of maritime tragedy. But the real show-off here is the shoreline, which behaves less like a beach and more like an archaeological slot machine. The tide goes out and suddenly you've got Roman coins, Viking jewellery, medieval tools, Georgian shoes, and timbers from ships that definitely didn't have a good day. The Victorians collected so much of it that the British Museum had to get involved, and even now archaeologists argue about how much is still buried under the sand, which is a polite academic way of saying we have no idea, but it's probably loads. And then, because Leasowe can't help itself, there's the grandstand. Yes, quiet, windy, slightly soggy Leasowe was home to the world's first purpose-built horse racing grandstand. Built in 1760 by the Earl of Derby for the original Liverpool races, the ancestor of the Grand National, it stood proudly until the Irish Sea decided it didn't like the idea and began nibbling the course away. Eventually, the whole thing was abandoned because the Irish Sea has clearly never respected sporting infrastructure and isn't about to start now. The name Leasowe itself means meadow by the water, which is charming until you realise it's also a warning. This is one of the lowest lying parts of the Wirral, a place where the sea has repeatedly tried to move in without asking. The modern seawall is basically the Wirral saying, no, sit, stay. And the sea, being the sea, replies, we'll see. The promenade is long, flat and windy, the kind of place where nothing happens but in a very cinematic way. I've walked it recently and you can easily imagine a BBC detective walking along, coat flapping, thinking about a case. Or a man in shorts eating chips in a gale, thinking about nothing at all. Both are equally plausible. Towering overconfidence. Our final glimpse from the water on this stage is of Wallasey, sitting on the northern tip of the Wirral, directly across the Mersey from Liverpool, connected by the Mersey ferry. Yes, that ferry, immortalised by Jerry and the Pacemakers, ensuring nobody can hear the words Mersey ferry without their brain immediately launching into the chorus like an involuntary reflex. The town's original name means Island of the Strangers, and is the most honest piece of branding the Wirral has ever produced. It sounds less like a place name and more like something etched into a cursed amulet you'd be strongly advised not to touch. You can imagine early travellers approaching the peninsula, seeing the town sign and thinking, right, we'll just go round. And to be fair, Wallasey was an island once, separated from the rest of the Wirral by marshes, tidal flats and whatever prehistoric horrors lived in the bit we now call Leaso. It's the only town in Britain whose founding vibe was essentially, you can come in, but don't get comfortable. Then there's New Brighton, Wallasey's Victorian resort district, named with the optimism of a man who believed branding alone could bend reality. In the 1830s, entrepreneur James Atherton bought up the land, laid out streets and built the Royal Hotel with the confidence of someone convinced that if you slap Royal and Brighton on enough buildings, tourists will appear out of sheer British politeness. And for a while, they did. But the Wirral's greatest act of overconfidence arrived in 1900. New Brighton Tower. A 567-foot steel lattice colossus built because someone looked at Blackpool Tower and thought, yes, but what if ours was bigger? It became the tallest building in Great Britain, a Victorian flex so enormous it could be seen from Liverpool, the Irish Sea and probably from Dublin if you stood on tiptoe. The surrounding complex was pure turn-of-the-century chaos. A 4,000 capacity ballroom, a theatre, gardens, a boating lake, a fun fair, an athletic ground, and, because the Wirral never does things by halves, a Japanese restaurant and 30,000 fairy lights. It pulled in 500,000 visitors in its first year, proving once again that if you build a giant metal tower next to a beach, the British will absolutely show up. And then, in classic local fashion, we simply didn't maintain it. By 1919, the steel had rusted so badly it was declared unsafe, and it was dismantled between 1919 and 1921. The ballroom limped on until 1969, when it too was demolished after a fire, leaving behind family myths and older Wirral residents insisting it was bigger than Blackpool's, you know, as if that alone should have guaranteed immortality. Today, New Brighton Tower stands as the perfect symbol of the area's energy. Ambitious, eccentric, briefly glorious, and then quietly removed while everyone was looking at the sea. Everything, everywhere, all at sea. And that's stage 30, another entire chapter spent in the Irish Sea, tracing the North Wales coast from Llandudno's Victorian elegance through Colwyn Bay's gardens, past Abergele's caravans and Towyn's floods, confronting Rhyl's spectacular decline before swinging east towards the English shore, and Southport's surprising resilience, Formby's red squirrels and ancient footprints, Crosby's iron men staring into the void, and the Wirral's lighthouses, ferries and rusting monuments to ambition. We've squinted at distant coastlines, catalogued triumphs and disasters in roughly equal measure, and finally, we're at the mouth of the Mersey, where Liverpool waits with its docks, its Beatles heritage, and the blessed relief of actual solid ground after 2 full stages of maritime approximation. Next stage, Liverpool. Pavement. Buildings you can actually enter rather than observe from a ferry deck 50 kilometres away. A radical concept after this much nautical nonsense. Thanks for listening and see you next time.